And good evening, everybody. It's nice to be here once again with all of you. So I'm glad that you were able to join us tonight for our interesting session. That's what I'm sure of. And as you can see, our special guest is right here with us, our expert, Dr. Vladimiro Silva. Welcome back. It's great to have you. This is your first webinar this year, but I'm sure there will be some more. So I'm already looking forward to see what you have prepared. As you can see, our topic tonight is definitely an interesting one. So, and I know that Dr. Vladimir always has many interesting things to say. So thank you so much. And how are you? How have you been? It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. Hi, Caroline. Thanks for having me once again. It's always a pleasure to participate in your events. It's always also a pleasure to share our experience with the patients, being able to answer their questions, hopefully. And so, like I said, I like being here. And so I don't, am I frozen? Is my image frozen?
No, we can see you perfectly. So
okay,
you will see everything.
Okay, so I will start sharing my screen.
Yes, let me just mention, of course, before we start, that we will go ahead with the presentation, but afterwards, as always, there will be time for your questions. So remember to type those in the chat section, and Dr. Silva will definitely get back to you with all the answers. And let me just add, if someone, if you weren't able to see our previous webinars, Dr. Vladimiro is the founder, CEO, and IVF Lab Director at Ferticentro, located in Portugal, and also Procreate, also located in Portugal, Coimbra. So we are always happy to have you here. And as you can see, the presentation is also here. So I guess we can go ahead, okay?
Yes,
perfect.
Let's go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you once again, Caroline. Today's webinar is about the topic was suggested by myivfanswer.com, is about what to do if you're afraid of having a baby with a genetic disease after IVF. This is a rather complex issue. This is kind of one of our worst fears, of everybody's worst fear, and especially if you're going through IVF, you're already going through a lot. You're passing through a very stressful treatment and process. Everything is so defying. Well, what if on top of that you'll have a baby affected with a genetic disease? What I'm talking about tonight is how IVF is used to prevent genetic diseases, what are the tools available in the market, what can we do about that, and how do we manage it in current IVF clinics. So like I was saying, IVF is actually one of the most used strategies to avoid genetic diseases. There are multiple strategies available, and in fact, so the title was how to not have a baby affected by genetic diseases after IVF. Actually, the question is more about, should be the opposite, how to use IVF to keep me from having a baby with a genetic disease. I think that would be the right question. So, because IVF can be used for many purposes regarding genetic diseases. I've separated it in 4 blocks. The first one, prevention of the transmission of known genetic diseases like monogenic diseases, things like, for example, Huntington disease. And I mean, there are a lot of diseases that are caused by just one gene, or there are cystic fibrosis, spinal muscular atrophy. There are hundreds, thousands of genetic diseases that can be transmitted if you are a carrier. And so IVF is a way of preventing that from happening. IVF is also used to screen for genetic risks. The most known are the age-related risks, because we all know that above the age of 35, women, for example, have a tendency towards producing abnormal eggs, and the number of abnormal eggs increases with age. The most known genetic condition that increases, especially after the age of 35, is trisomy 21. Down syndrome, but there are many other diseases that can be identified via IVF, and also the fact that there are chromosomal imbalances and problems at that level could also lead to treatment failure, which is obviously what we all don't want. In the third box, I've written the screening for rare diseases. This is a completely different set of tests for genetic diseases. This is I'm talking here about the genetic carrier tests. These are obviously important between both members of a couple, but they can also be very important while selecting a donor, an egg donor, a sperm donor, a double donation treatment. So obviously there are pros and cons about this option. We will discuss it later. And then obviously IVF can also be used to treat severe diseases. We can even find Hcli compatible embryos that will allow to treat babies for whom there is no other alternative. So this is what we're talking about tonight. I hope you find it interesting. It is a very complex theme. Every single one of these topics will justify 1 or 2 webinars, so I will try to summarize everything and put things in a very perspective and patient-oriented, in a very patient-oriented and objective perspective. But obviously, if you have questions at the end of the webinar, I will be very happy to answer all of them. So when we talk about prevention of genetic diseases, we talk about the pgt-m, pre-implantation genetic testing for monogenic diseases, or for structural rearrangements, pgt-sr. The screening for age-related diseases in people, for example, who have normal karyotypes who are not affected by any known disease. It's the pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploides. Aneuploides are numerical chromosomal abnormalities. So it's when you have the wrong number of chromosomes. The most known, trisomy 21, where you have 3 chromosomes 21. Okay, and pgt-sr appears again on this topic because pgt-sr appears again on this topic because it's also something that we can screen for, because there are inversions, there are translocations, there are all sorts of chromosome duplication. So there are all sorts of numeric chromosomal abnormalities that can be identified this way. On the third square, we have the screening, the carrier screening tests. And so nowadays, there are many packs available from many companies in the market. Some of them are screening for 300 diseases, 600 diseases, 400, 570, 2,200 diseases. I mean, the sky is the limit. I will discuss this in a more detailed way, but nowadays we can even, and we're talking about extremely rare diseases, and obviously in the part of the Hcli compatibility, it's to find, for example, a baby that can be a bone marrow donor for his sibling, brother or sister who has a very serious disease. Okay. So we have done all of that in our clinic. We do this on and on, for especially pgt-a on a daily basis, but we do all of these techniques very often. They are part of routine of modern IVF clinics all over the world. So starting with the pgt-m, the pre-implantation genetic testing for monogenic diseases. Monogenic diseases means a disease that only affects one gene. One gene is a very small portion of our DNA. It is extremely tiny, but problems at its level can cause major health issues and very serious diseases. pgt-m is so used to avoid the chance of having a child with an inherited genetic disorder by analyzing embryos before transfer and identifying those that do not carry the altered disease-causing gene. This is a technique that is intended to patients who are known to carry these serious genetic diseases, either because they run in the family. For example, this is especially important in autosomal dominant diseases. This means that one gene is enough to cause the disease, or in recessive diseases where we can be a carrier for that disease and not having the disease. Where the difference between an autosomal dominant and a recessive disorder is that if the disease is autosomal dominant, one copy of the gene is enough for us to have the disease. If the disease is recessive, we can have one copy of the disease and still be completely healthy. But if we have a child with someone carrying that same genetic disease, then there is a 25% chance of having an affected child, because we can both partners can both transmit the affected gene. Okay, we have to custom design these tests for every patient. These are very often rather complex situations. Like I said, Huntington's disease, neurofibromatosis, cystic fibrosis. There are hundreds and hundreds and thousands, actually thousands of genetic diseases. So this is not for every patient. We have to know what we are looking for. We have to have a valid reason to suspect that that person is at risk for that particular disease. And so it all starts with us doing genetic tests, identifying the problem, knowing exactly what to look for. Then we have to do the pre-implantation genetic test in order to prepare for the procedure, and then we will create the embryos. We take them until day 5 or day 6, sometimes even day 7, and then we make a little hole in the embryo. We pick up some cells and we analyze those cells genetically. And obviously, we only put back in the uterus embryos that are considered to be genetically normal. Okay, then we have the pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploides. This used to be called pre-implantation genetic screening because we are screening for genetic risks. Normally, these are age-related. Okay, what's the difference between a diagnosis and the screening? The screening is when you don't know if the problem is there, but you're trying to see if that explains any possible previous failure, or if you want to prevent a failure because that patient is at risk to have a problem. Normally, the most classical indication for this kind of treatment is advanced maternal age. So pgt-a is a genetic test performed on embryos to screen for numerical chromosomal abnormalities. Like I was saying in the beginning, an aneuploidy is when we have an embryo with an extra or missing a chromosome. These embryos with extra or missing chromosomes often fail to implant and lead to a miscarriage, and in some cases they are compatible with life, and so they can lead to a birth of a child with a genetic condition. Embryos that are found to be chromosomally normal are referred as euploid as opposed to aneuploid, and are the most likely to lead to a successful pregnancy. Unfortunately, having a euploid embryo is not a synonym of having a pregnancy. Even when we transfer euploid embryos, we don't have 100% pregnancy 100% pregnancy probability, but it sure helps, as I will show you further in this presentation. At Ferticentro, we do pre-implantation genetic testing with next generation sequencing, which is the most modern technique, and nowadays we analyze all 24 chromosomes. So we have 46 chromosomes. They are organized in pairs. We have 2 copies of chromosome 1, chromosome 2, and so on. And then we have the sexual chromosomes. When, if you are a man, you have a chromosome X and a chromosome Y. If you are a woman, you have 2 chromosome X. So we have 24 different chromosomes, and this technique will allow us to quantify each one of them and see if they have the the quantity of each chromosome is normal, or if there is an extra or a missing chromosome. Okay, chromosomal abnormalities are obviously detected before the embryos are transferred, and so this allows patients to make informed decisions about their treatment. For example, if someone age 42 is having aneuploid embryos, meaning embryos with these genetic abnormalities, that person could, for example, decide to move on with egg donation instead of keep trying with her own eggs. Okay, this is kind of the classical example. So it is a very important take-home message about this kind of procedure. pgt-a doesn't make, or pgs as you prefer, doesn't make embryos better. Okay, if an embryo is bad, science has no way to transform it into a viable embryo. However, it gives us information and it gives us the capacity to select the best embryos. Nowadays, and obviously, if we know which are the best embryos, the number of cycles needed to obtain a pregnancy will be lower. Nowadays, we have two types of pgt-a. Invasive pgt-a, where we do that hole in the embryo that I was describing before. We take up like 5 cells, we analyze them by next generation sequencing, and we say, well, these ones are good, and those ones are not good. Now, these days, there have been recent developments in the area of non-invasive pgt-a. This means that instead of doing a hole in the embryo, we are analyzing the culture media where embryos are cultured, because there is free DNA like swimming in the culture media. And so by analyzing that DNA, we can understand, we can have an idea, because nowadays there is a correspondence of more than 80%, in some cases more than 90%, to the genetic characteristics of the embryo. And so nowadays we are capable of testing the culture media, so we don't touch the embryo, and we still can say whether that embryo is viable or not. This is a major breakthrough that is on the way. It's still kind of experimental. Non-invasive pgt-a is doing its first steps, but it is certainly the future, and looks like a very promising technique. But I would say that more than 95% of all pgt-a cycles in the world are invasive pgt-a, because there is a number of technical limitations still associated with non-invasive pgt-a. Well, why is this useful? Because, like I was saying, we humans are not a very fertile species. Okay, for example, here, take this study from the lab iGenomics. They were evaluating the incidence of aneuploid blastocysts. Blastocysts are day 5 embryos. Aneuploid are the ones with the wrong number of chromosomes, according to maternal age. And as you can see here, we start with 36%, 36.9% when we are on the top of our fertility. Okay, so this is with an egg donor. And then with the progression of maternal age, we see that percentage increasing. And at the age of 43, 76% of the embryos are carrying a genetic abnormality. Okay, it's not 100%, so this kind of gives us hope for many patients. However, we have to think that in order to have a viable, you will need 7 blastocysts to have one that is viable. Okay, that's what this 76% percentage means. This is a lot. Having 7 blastocysts at the age of 43 or 44, it's a very huge number. If you've gone through IVF, you know how difficult it is to get a good number of blastocysts at any age, and especially after the age of 35. And obviously, beyond the age of 40, it is extremely difficult. So statistics is not on our side. And so this is why above a certain age threshold, in Portugal we normally consider it 39 years old because it's we're here, we are on 60%, 61.7% actually in this study. So we know that 61% of the embryos at this age are abnormal. So this means that more than half of the embryos are carrying genetic abnormalities. In fact, on the title of this graphic, it says 64% between ages 38 and 40. And so this is where we have put our cutoff. Above the age of 39, we always advise patients to consider the possibility of doing pgt-a because it really can make a difference. It will not transform bad embryos into good ones, but it will give patients a very important information on their fertility options, on their life options. And so this is why we are fierce defenders of applying this technique in advanced maternal age cases. And why is that so important? Obviously, we can take a look at these graphics. On the left-hand side, we can see the implantation rates on the gray bars with pgt-a, on the orange bars without pgt-a. And we can see that there is actually not much of a difference between the different age groups if we use pgt-a. Why is that? Because we are only transferring genetically normal embryos. And the genetic constitution is the most important factor for an embryo to implant in the uterus. Why are the orange bars lower? Like I said before, this is not because pgt-a is making the embryos better. This is because we're transferring good and bad embryos all along without being able to identify them based on the classic lab techniques. If we use morphology alone, it's very difficult to understand whether an embryo is viable or not. If we use video time-lapse, it becomes easier, but not a miracle. If you use pgt-a, then you can definitely identify the embryos that are more viable. Okay, so obviously when we talk about delivery rates, it's like a copy of the previous graphic. And very important, if we talk about miscarriage rates, we see that after pgt-a, the miscarriage rates increase slightly with age, which is normal because age does play a role. However, without pgt-a, it sharply increases. And why is that? Because without pgt-a, we are transferring embryos that are genetically abnormal. And we know that, statistically speaking, 70% of all miscarriages have a genetic cause, an embryonic cause. And so this is why we get these numbers. So take-home message, pgt-a is a really important tool in modern IVF clinics, and we strongly advise it, especially after the age of 39. Okay, then we have on box number 2 the pgt-sr. When we are still in box number 2, because pgt-a was also in box number 2, we have the pre-implantation genetic testing for structural rearrangements. What does it mean? These are karyotype abnormalities like balance translocations, inversions. So what is that? Chromosomal rearrangements can be inherited or may occur spontaneously. That's when we call it a de novo abnormality. We think that we estimate that 1 in every 500 people carry a balanced reciprocal translocation. This means that these persons, because they are balanced, they are normal. They don't have any health condition. They don't have any health issue. They don't have any physical characteristics that makes this distinction. However, these persons have, because what's missing in a chromosome is actually attached to another chromosome. And so the total amount of DNA that a person needs to have its normal life, his normal life. So we have all the DNA that we need. And so most of these persons are unaware of their balanced translocation carrier status, and they live normal, healthy lives. Normally, they only find out that they are carriers for these abnormalities when they are trying to have a baby and they have repeated miscarriage, or they face infertility, or and then we ask them to do a karyotype, which is a blood test to check for your chromosomes. We are born with the same karyotype that we will die. Okay, our karyotype is the same for life, and then we detect that, for example, there is this imbalance. You can see above, it is a genetic test performed on embryos to screen for chromosomal structural rearrangements, normally caused by balanced translocations and inversions. Okay, we only do this in patients who we know that carry this abnormality. So we have to do the karyotype first. If we see that there is an imbalance, we try to correct it. We recommend this test, sorry. It is important to understand that the persons that are carrying these balanced rearrangements can pass down the same rearrangement. And so, in that case, the embryos will be healthy. They will be as healthy as their parents. Okay, but they are at a very high risk to produce embryos with unbalanced chromosomal rearrangements. This usually does not lead to a successful pregnancy. Normally, it's a miscarriage or a negative pregnancy result, but it is not impossible. There is, obviously, it depends of the abnormality that we're talking about, but there is the risk of birth of a child with a genetic abnormality. So using pgt-sr will naturally increase the chances of having a successful pregnancy. And obviously, we can make sure that only the embryos with the correct balance, meaning like their father or their mother, and the embryos that have a normal karyotype are transferred, and naturally this leads to a higher pregnancy rate. Examples of structural rearrangements: duplications, more than one chromosome of a type; deletions, missing one chromosome; inversions, a change in the shape of the chromosome; and translocation, a chromosome sharing, splitting a little part of a chromosome is attached to another chromosome and the other way around. Okay, so chromosomes can change little bits between each other, but if we have all the information, that person will be normal, but there will be a certain risk of passing the abnormality that was identified. The third topic of the genetic tests that we use in IVF are the genetic carrier screening tests. We're all carriers for something, okay? We are, as humans, we are carrying multiple genetic diseases. It's normal, okay? There is probably not a single human being who is not a carrier for a genetic disease. The risk only exists if we have a baby with a person who carries the same disease. Where we are talking about recessive diseases, okay, not dominant diseases. The big question here is it worth knowing the truth? That's actually a debate. This is something that we do a lot, but it is very, very important that patients take very well-informed decisions about this issue. So first of all, let's explain this a little bit. If the father is a carrier for a disease and the mother is also a carrier for a certain disease, 25% of their children, the ones, this is a graphic from genomics, obviously, the ones in orange will be healthy because neither of them will be passing the affected gene. 50% of the children will be receiving one copy of the normal gene and one copy of the abnormal gene. It could be the mothers or the fathers, but 25% of them, and this is obviously theoretical, will receive the affected genes both from their father and their mother. So these are the ones at risk. These are the ones that we want to avoid with these tests. And so, how does it work? So this is an example of the test that we work with at our clinics. It's from iGenomics. So we screen, we have two types of screening tests. One that screens for up to 570 diseases, and the another one that screens for more than 2,200 diseases. It is very important for people to understand 55% of human beings are a carrier for at least one mutation from the 570, and 67% are carriers for more than 2,200. I can tell you that in our clinic, we've never found a person that is not a carrier for any disease after doing the CGT exome, the one with more than 2,200 diseases. We have a few negatives in this 570 diseases package. And on the mean number of mutations per individual is 2.7 in the when we test for 2,200 diseases, and 1.7 when we test for 570 diseases. And so obviously this is useful because these are rare diseases. Some of them are rarer than others. And so we're talking about diseases like cystic fibrosis, spinal muscular atrophy, whatever. You have the sickle cell anemia, Fragile X syndrome, thalassemia. You have all of that here. And the proportion of carriers is actually quite high. This is different than the incidence of the disease. So if you're a carrier for cystic fibrosis, you have a chance in 25 of finding, having a baby with a person who is also a carrier. And if that happens, you will have a 25% chance of having a baby with a cystic fibrosis, okay? That's how it works. So most diseases are a lot more rare than this listed here. This could be very important when patients are doing treatment with donors, because, I mean, if you are a couple and you need egg or sperm donation, you don't want to bring diseases into your family. You're already having an invasion of your privacy with the donor stepping in. So you just want to keep that scenario to avoid that scenario. But obviously, the problem is that we cannot test for everything. There is a limit, and this could also be, so just to explain a little bit, how does it work? For example, in the case of egg donation, we start to test the husband. We will see if the husband is a carrier of 3 or 4 diseases, for instance, and then we will test the donor. Obviously, we already have the DNA from the donor, and we will test her for those same diseases to see if she's a carrier of the same diseases as the husband or not. Okay, so the problem here is whether this is a Pandora's box or not, because when we make the decision of doing this test, we will be receiving an important information that we are healthy carriers for 3, 4, 5. Once we had a patient with 12 diseases. So we are carriers of a lot of diseases, and then what can we do with that information? I mean, every single time we might need to use a donor, we need to test for these diseases, because we won't be in peace. Okay, we know that that risk exists, and so if you're starting IVF with, for example, a single lady with sperm donation, if she tests the sperm donor and she finds out that she's a carrier for 3 or 4 diseases, every time she does an insemination with a different donor or the same donor, she will have to test for it. Otherwise, she won't rest. It's a very relevant information. And then it's an information that you will also have to give your children, because, if you're a carrier, there is a 50% chance that your son is also a carrier, an unaffected carrier. And that's a relevant information for his or her reproductive future. And for instance, if you have another kid and you're having and you're doing this test to have a second kid, then you will have to give that information to the first kid. And maybe you don't want to share that information with that kid because it's a very private information. Maybe you don't want to disclose this information to your kid. Obviously, you can only do that. You should only do it at the age of 18, but it's still a very relevant information. And let's say it's an egg donation cycles, and we find out that the male partner is a carrier for 3 diseases, and his brother is also trying to have a baby. So if he is a carrier, probably his brother is also a carrier. He's at risk to be a carrier. And so he holds a very important information that can affect very seriously his brother's life and his brother's family. However, that person has the right not to disclose that information to his brother because he might not want his brother to know that he's doing an IVF with egg donation. Okay, so there is a series of very important questions. So it's undeniable that this is a very relevant information, but patients need to make informed decisions when they decide to have access to this information. If you don't know, you won't suffer with the information you get. If you look for it, you will find something because, like I said, we're all carriers for something. Okay, and then the last type of tests, it's when we look for HLA compatible embryos. This is a very complex issue, but this is only used in very dramatic situations where the only way to heal a child with a very severe disease is by finding a compatible stem cell donor. And many often the only solution is to have a genetically compatible sibling, and this is a very complex situation. These are very complex situations from an ethical point of view. These, in Portugal at least, these situations require approval by the national IVF authorities. We've had one of these cases at Ferticentro. Luckily it went well, but this is extremely difficult to make. We depend a lot on our luck, and we might need a lot of embryos to be able to find one or two that are compatible. Okay, because at the end of the day, what we all want is an healthy child. And so we as adults, we as IVF practitioners, you as patients, we know that we have to do what it takes to make sure that our children don't have a genetic condition. Obviously, this is not easy. This involves expensive procedures. This involves very complex decisions. This involves complex ethical issues, and so I'm available to discuss all of that. This is a picture of our team, part of our team at Ferticentro, and so thank you for listening to me. I'm very happy to answer all your possible questions. Caroline, the word is yours.
Thank you so much indeed. Thank you. It's been a great presentation as always, of course, and well, very, very interesting. And well, as you know, time for the questions. There are some questions ready, but of course, you know, it is your time. So if you have questions, go ahead, type those in, and Dr. Vladimiro will happily answer all of them, I'm sure. So let's get going with the first question that we have. Okay, so this will be the first question from Christina. I'm 41 and I'm doing embryo banking. I have 4 frozen embryos frozen on day 3, and I had an egg collection yesterday, waiting to see how the 2 embryos we got are evolving. They don't do genetic testing at that clinic and recommend freezing on day 3. If you have a few embryos, how many more embryos would you recommend adding up before transfer? We were thinking to do a couple of more cycles, but not sure if enough. I have a very low AMH, and I get 2-3 eggs at once.
So my advice here is definitely take the embryos to day 5, because on day 3, day 3 is a very informative day. Okay, so we know a lot about the embryos already when we get to that point. Caroline, I'm not seeing the question anymore. Okay, so here we go. So day 3 is a very important day. It's a very relevant day for us to understand whether these embryos, the embryos are viable or not. But at the age of 41, it is really important to take them to day 5. And I definitely would advise pgt-a in these circumstances, because by doing pgt-a, by doing pgt-a, we are understanding whether these embryos are viable or not. To answer the question from Christina, I will use the statistics that I was pointing out in my presentation. I actually have to go a little back. I'm taking a look at it, but she's 41, and we know that at 41, 73% of her embryos are not viable. Okay, this is what nature gives us. It's 73% of the blastocysts, but not all day 3 embryos reach the blastocyst stage. So first, we need to see how many of these will reach the blastocyst stage, and then we know that 73% of them, this means, roughly speaking, 1 in every 7 or 6 are not viable of those blastocysts. So if you want to be statistically sure, because statistics for low numbers can also be very tricky, but if you want to be statistically sure, you would need about 7 blastocysts, which is a lot. So do a few embryo banking cycles, take your embryos to day 5, do the pgt-a definitely, and then decide accordingly.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your very first question and your help with that. And Christina has something that she would like to tell you, of course. Thanks.
Thank you, Christina. My pleasure.
Thank you indeed. And let's have a look. Lucy has another question. I have a balanced translocation, but my clinic only did pgt-a, not pgt-sr. Why?
Well, it's kind of the same. Sometimes it's just the name of the technique. pgt-sr is, well, if you have a balanced translocation, this means that we know what we're looking for, and so we should use targeted probes, because when we are doing a pgt-a, we are screening for the whole chromosomes the same way. When we are doing pgt-sr, we are targeting the chromosomes that are actually potentially affected by the translocation. So, but sometimes in current language, we just say pgt-a when we're talking about pgt-sr. I sincerely doubt that they didn't look more carefully to the affected chromosomes, because that wouldn't happen. Answering the question, you have a very clear indication for pgt-sr with probes and specific for the chromosomes affected by the translocation.
Very clear. Thank you so much for the clarification, of course. And Anna has another question. Is there a difference in embryo quality if both are euploid 5AA, but one is from a 30-year-old and one from a 40-year-old?
This is actually a very interesting question. Well, first of all, 5AA is a morphological classification. It has its importance. In the past, that was all we had, and so we talked a lot about morphology. But these days, we're not caring so much about morphology as we did before. We're more focused on video morphokinetics, meaning video time-lapse imaging of the embryos. We even have artificial intelligence algorithms that help us with that. And so the most important aspect here is the fact that both embryos are euploid. However, we know that with the progression of age, there are other parts of the embryo that become more fragile. There are studies about, especially about mitochondrial DNA, that say that we need the mitochondria are a part of the cell that produces energy, and so there are very interesting studies where scientists were replacing the mitochondria from a 40-year-old woman with the mitochondria of an egg donor, and then those embryos gained a lot of capacity. They obtained a lot of euploid embryos. And why is that? Because this is not all about the DNA in the nucleus, which is what we've been talking about. This is also about the strength of the egg, the strength of the embryo. And so I would say the embryo from the 30-year-old has a better prognosis than the one from the 40-year-old. But I mean, the fact that they are both euploid, like we saw in one of the graphics that I showed, makes them both of them very good prognosis embryos. And in that study that I was showing, they didn't even find statistically significant differences between the probability of implantation from both of them. So I would say they are both good. Okay, if they are both yours, choose the one from earlier, and then leave the one obtained at 40 for later. But there could be a difference in quality. Yes.
All right, thank you again for yet another question and answer. And let's have a look. Anna has another question.
Thank you, Anna.
I see it here. Okay, sorry, just a second. What's the difference between NGS and another pgt-a option? Is it specific chromosome abnormalities that NGS checks for and not pgt-a, or something else? Those issues not detected by regular pgt-a, how common are those?
NGS is more sensitive and more accurate, okay? Because in the past we were using a technique called FISH, then it was a CGTA microarrays, and now it's NGS, okay? So NGS is the most powerful tool that science has at this very moment. Maybe a year from now something else appears, but right now it doesn't even make sense not to use NGS. I don't think any of the main groups all over the world uses other techniques other than NGS.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And let me go to the next question, which I missed. Lucy is right here. So also, apart from my discovered on karyotype BT, should we do CGT tests in case there are other genes issues? I had 11 euploid and 1 high mosaic and 0 euploid embryos.
I don't think the CGT makes sense. Those are completely unrelated things, okay? The CGT is a test for people that are carriers for recessive genetic diseases, okay? This is absolutely not non-related with a balanced translocation. So you can do CGT in order to identify that, but that has nothing to do with your other problem, okay? This will not help you being more sure about the issue that really affects you, because you're having 11 aneuploid, 1 high mosaic, zero euploid. Maybe the high mosaic would be the solution, because I expressly keep that out of my presentation because it's a very complex issue. But so in the embryos there are sometimes multiple cell lines, and we risk selecting the wrong one and so on. So the mosaicism sometimes can deceive us while analyzing an embryo. But we also know that typically, at least until a certain percentage of mosaicism, meaning embryos with more than one cell line, we can identify the normal cell line can overlap the abnormal cell line, and so these low mosaic embryos could actually implant and become normal babies. Even last week I received the result of an amniocentesis from one of those embryos. We were very afraid, but luckily everything is fine, and we're waiting for a little baby girl, which is perfect. And it was a mosaic with a 30 or 40% mosaicism. Okay, so here CGT has nothing to do with balanced translocation. Those are completely different issues. You can test for that. I wouldn't add confusion to the equation, okay? If I was Lucy, I would prefer to focus on the main issue, which is the balanced translocation, the possibility of doing maybe thinking about egg donation, I don't know, or I mean, egg donation is certainly an alternative here, but that I would consider very seriously. But I wouldn't be doing CGT because she already has something to worry. She doesn't need any more issues, like finding out that she's a carrier for 3 or 4 diseases and her husband, or whatever, for another 2 or 3. So that would be an additional, unnecessary additional complication.
Wonderful. Again, thank you for your explanation. Okay, let's have a look. There are more questions coming up. So how common is it to have a miscarriage with an NGS tested good quality embryo?
I showed the percentage here. I have to take a look. So it will depend on your age and other factors. It is below 20%. It's like between 6-7% and 15, 18%, depending on your age group. Obviously, if you are below 30, it will be around 6 or 7%. If you are over 40, it could be more about 18, 90%. But these miscarriages are not of genetic cause, okay? These miscarriages are caused by other by factors others than the genetics of the embryo, and we all know that when female age progresses, there is a number of factors that increase the probability of having a problem, like hypertension, like preeclampsia. I mean, you just have to gestational diabetes. There are lots and lots of issues that come associated with pregnancy on a later age that are independent of the quality of the genetic quality of the embryo, and those we cannot avoid.
Okay, again, thank you so much indeed. Lucy, previous patient, also says thanks. And let's have a look. Okay, another question, a bit of a longer question we have here. I am 50, my husband is 37. We have done 8 donor egg transfers with grade A blastocysts from 3 different donors at 2 different clinics. We have had every test possible on both sides, all normal, no explanation of failure. I had a natural pregnancy at age 45, missed miscarriage. We never had done pgt-a. Would you recommend this for donor egg embryos or any other tests?
Well, we don't recommend this for donor egg embryos because, like I was showing, the probability of having a baby, a normal baby in a genetically normal baby in an egg donor is very high. So in principle, we have seen that the probability of pregnancy is not that different with and without pgt-a, because almost a lot of the embryos are normal. So I wouldn't recommend it for egg donation cycles. On the other hand, in this particular case, we have 3 different egg donors, 2 different clinics, 8 egg donation cycles. So it's a lot. Okay, so I don't think pgt-a would have made any difference here, because we have I mean, between all of this, you certainly had viable embryos. Okay, all of these clinics, all of these embryos, all of these egg donors, it's almost, well, either the problem comes from your husband, okay, because there are also, we're talking a lot about the quality of the egg, but the quality of the sperm is also a very important factor. So either the problem comes from the male partner, or it has something to do with the implantation conditions. And then there are multiple tests that can be done on the uterus in order to try to identify the possible recurrent implantation failure causes. This would be a completely different webinar. I've done one of that about that topic as well in the past, but because there are multiple things that can be evaluated. NK is saying that she had a chemical pregnancy and a chemical miscarriage. Well, it's kind of the same, okay? Obviously, when we talk about biochemical pregnancies and early miscarriages, the genetic factor can play a role. That will probably be an indication in favor of taking a deeper look into the male side. We can test the sperm for genetic abnormalities, for example, like the sperm fish test. But I don't know. I would focus on the endometrium, because it's a lot. It's a lot of she's saying that she did fish and DNA fragmentation test, and probably it was all normal. So maybe you should then focus on the endometrium, because I mean, it's a lot of embryos, a lot of egg donors, different clinics. They can, I mean, it's too much to be just lack of luck. Okay, there should be something there that indicate that justifies these failures. You need a very you need to study it very carefully, because there's clearly something keeping you from getting pregnant, and your your doctors still haven't found that reason, which is something that also happens to us. Okay, this is unfortunately something that we cannot fully control.
And actually, there is a follow-up. Could it be possible hidden antiphospholipid syndrome?
Well, it's very unlikely. Okay, if you had a normal antiphospholipid test, it's very unlikely. Okay, I'm not a specialist on this field, but these rare conditions can happen. I would say that there are other factors that are far more likely to justify this than these extremely unusual explanations. I'm not saying that it is impossible, because nobody can say never, but it does seem really unlikely.
Thank you for the follow-ups, and of course for your explanation.
Okay.
Thanks
you.
indeed.
And good luck.
Yes, of course, as always, we keeping our fingers crossed for all of you. So thank you so much. And let's have a look. Another question, a bit of a different question. I believe it's Mitochondria, I think. I'm not sure here.
Yes.
I think it is related to mitochondria of day 5 embryo.
Yes, well, this is an experimental scoring system. It's not something that is used on the daily routine. We actually, one of the labs that we work with, iGenomics, uses that mito score. This is related. That score gives us an indication of the capacity of the embryo to divide and to to implant itself. It's sort of a measure of the energy of the embryo. So this kind of matches the first question from Anna, because it's the difference between an old and a young embryo. So the activity of the mitochondria can definitely play a role. That is absolutely proven and consensual. The only thing that's not proven and consensual is whether the mitoscore can actually reflect that point. So yes, we can take we can use that indicator. We should prioritize the embryos with the highest ranking, but we cannot put too much hope on this indicator because we really don't know what's its real value.
Again, understandable. Thank you so much indeed for the question. Interesting one as well. And from our previous question, patient, of course, thank you. And let me have a look. There are a few questions left, like 3 of them. So, of course, we will be slowly coming to an end. But as you know, if you have more, you know what to do. There's still time for it. So go ahead. Yeah. Okay, let's have a look. Next question is ASD, autism, Asperger's syndrome, detectable in any of the screenings?
No. We're not, well, as far as I know, no. There is no specific test for pgt-a in autism or the spectrum of autism diseases. So unfortunately, this is not something that we can control.
Thank you again for the question, for your help with that. And let's have a look. Next question is here. I'm 41 and my husband is 47. We started this journey 10 years ago. 1 cycle with my own eggs, no luck. 2 cycles with frozen egg donors, no luck. 2 cycles with embryo donor, no success. What would you advise in our situation?
I mean, it's a little bit like the previous situation. Maybe we should pay a little attention to the endometrium because, I mean, 2 cycles with own eggs, well, she's now 41, okay? So, okay, probably she's now 41, so probably she started in a younger age. Well, she started 10 years ago. She started at 31. She was still very young. So it was like she was her own egg donor, which in principle should have been a good prognosis factor. So these 2 initial cycles, assuming that they were done before the age of 35, were already like egg donation cycles. And then frozen egg donors, okay, it's the fact that it is frozen is not very relevant if the embryos were good. 2 cycles with embryo donor. Well, embryo donation cases sometimes we're not, people donate the embryos that they don't use, and so these are not first choices. So here I would say that between the own cycles, which were kind of like egg donation cycles, between the natural attempts at a very young age, 2 cycles with egg donors, I would say that I wouldn't start a new cycle without assessing the endometrium, at least. Okay, so there are tests about the window of implantation, the microbiome, screening for infectious diseases in the endometrium, uterine malformations and abnormalities. There could be a number of factors, and obviously also systemic issues like immune diseases, hematological disorders. Those are more rare, less likely. There is actually some debate whether, for example, the thrombophilia, one of the most classical hematological disorders, should even be part of this equation. But but anyway, without further clarification, I don't think it makes sense to move on with another attempt, at least without making it clear. This could actually be just bad luck, okay? So good luck, Michael, but I mean, that's my advice.
Thank you, indeed, again for that. And let's have a look. There's another question. Have you ever heard about some couples transferring aneuploids? I read that about that
Yes,
once.
there is a tendency, especially in the United States, where patients decide to transfer aneuploid embryos. Well, it's a long shot. Okay, they do that because they have the hope that somewhere in the middle of the embryo could be a normal cell line that takes over the embryo and overlaps the abnormal cell line. This is something that can happen. It might happen in a very small percentage of embryos, and I think that it is something that you can do. But you should do it in a very informed way. So, because if you do it, um, and there are even articles and strategies to prioritize which aneuploid embryos should be transferred first, because there are aneuploid embryos that are not compatible with life. So if you transfer those, either you have a negative result or you have a pregnancy, and then you should do prenatal diagnosis like chorial biopsy or amniocentesis. And then there are embryos that are aneuploid, but they are compatible with life and could lead to the birth of an handicapped child, for example, trisomy 21, 18, 13. So it's very important to be careful with this. Make informed decisions, have a good genetic counseling before doing it, and then select very well which embryos can be transferred or not, because maybe they are all compatible with life. But so it's a question of making that decision, knowing that chances are little. Okay, they are not just theoretical, because there in scientific literature we have a few cases where that was done and normal babies have born, but the likelihood of that happening is extremely low. Well, in fact, the reason why there are articles about that is because those are so rare. Those situations are so rare. Okay. So good luck,
Thanks,
Lucy.
Lucy. Indeed, interesting question as well. And next one, again, Sebastian has something interesting here. Is there a risk to lose viable embryos due to wrong diagnosis on aneuploidy? Is there a difference between NGS and array CGH?
Well, I start with the end, the last question. Yes, NGS is much more powerful than array CGH. I don't think array CGH is still used these days. It was an old technique that has been replaced. Wrong diagnosis of aneuploidy, obviously, that can happen. There is no such thing as a perfect technique to identify the viable embryos. We all know that even NGS has like 98% of capacity to identify its results. So theoretically speaking, there could always be one or other embryo that, and also obviously, if we have two cell lines and we are unlucky enough only to collect cells from the bad cell line, yes, we can lose an embryo to a wrong diagnosis of aneuploidy. This is not something that's very likely to happen, but theoretically speaking, it can happen.
Wonderful. Thank you once more for yet another interesting question, as I mentioned. And there are more coming up. So let me go straight to that one. I had a miscarriage with euploid NGS tested embryo. Are there any tests I should do before next cycle, Ira, Emma, Alice are done?
Well, those would be my first line suggestion. And then we should look for hematological for immunitary factors, which immune factors, which is a very complex topic since there are many tests that can be done. We would also need to look into the uterus because sometimes there are fibroids, malformations, adenomyosis. I don't know. There are local uterine factors that can affect that. And then check for the less common things like those immune and hematological factors. But it could also be I don't know exactly the NS situation, but and it also depends when did the miscarriage happen. But it could be an infection. I mean, there are many things that can cause that. It's difficult. It's a very week 7, says Anna. It's early, okay, and it's more, well, being that early, it should be more associated with immune factors or hematological disorders, but this is really difficult, okay. We would have to take a deep look at it, and because I believe that your doctors have certainly told you the same. We really don't know what to think in these situations.
And there are some additional details. HCG was 168 on day 12, maybe a bit low from start.
I mean, it's a bit low, okay, but we have babies born from values lower than this, okay? So sometimes it starts low, but then it starts rising. I even have a baby from an HCG of 16, so not me, one of our patients, but so this is, I mean, obviously I would prefer to see 500 or 600, but 168, we have hundreds of babies born that started with this level of beta HCG. But I mean, we don't know. We really don't know. That's I don't think that's the explanation has to do with this. This is more like the consequence of the ongoing miscarriage that was already taking place.
Thank you, Anna, for your questions, follow-ups, of course.
And good luck,
And
Anna.
good luck indeed. And let me have a look. Okay. Next question is, do you think that time-lapse incubators would replace the embryo test in the future as a non-invasive technique?
No, very quick. No, because I mean, they give us very important and very relevant informations. Okay, I wouldn't. We were the pioneers of the embryoscope in Portugal. We have 2 embryoscopes in our Coimbra. We do 100% of our treatments in the embryoscope in both clinics. And so we are a very fierce defenders of this technology. However, we have to know what can we do with it and what can't we do. And we've been using it for more than 8 years now, 9 years almost now. So we have a lot of experience with this. So I believe that especially with the artificial intelligence involved in the process, it is a very, very important tool. It will help us a lot. It will optimize the culture conditions for the embryos, and so it's a wonderful breakthrough. However, testing the embryo will always be more accurate, and especially if non-invasive pgt-a takes develops like we all expect it to, and I think we will end up with a very, very powerful method to identify viable embryos without doing biopsies in the embryos, which is a really important breakthrough.
Crystal clear. Thank you so much for the answer. Definitely interesting.
And good luck
To
Abdul
make sure. Thank you. Okay, and if you can take a look at this, what does a week 10 missed miscarriage suggest? It relates to genetics, immunology, or?
I really don't know. Well, since this is NK and she was having problems with many donors, many clinics, So I would say that it shouldn't be genetic, because if you're having these problems with so many egg donors from different places, I would say, well, unless there is a male side genetic issue, okay, once again, we cannot exclude that. But if there isn't a male factor here, I would say that it's more. Even so, even in a natural pregnancy. So if you're having so many miscarriage, well, in a natural pregnancy, it depends on the age, okay? But again, you're having negative results in 8 egg donation cycles. So it's far more likely that the problem is on the uterus than on the embryo. So yeah, NK is saying that she was 45 by then. At the age of 45, it's probably genetic, okay? But obviously you had that factor and we cannot ignore it.
Understood. Again, thank you so much indeed. And
You.
there's a thank you as well here.
Okay.
And might be our final question for tonight, okay? So if you have something else that you would like to ask, go ahead, do it, okay? And let me show you this question that we have. What is the concordance between trophectoderm and ICM in embryo test?
It's I'm assuming that this, just to explain the other attendants to this webinar, these are parts of the blastocyst. The trophoectoderm, it's where we are nowadays doing the biopsies, and the inner cellular mass, which is another part of the embryo. It is believed that the trophoectoderm is more representative of the real genetic potential of the embryo, and the level of mosaicism in the inner cellular mass is higher. Again, these are all theories. What we are, and so the concordance between them, I mean, nowadays we're all focusing on the trophoectoderm because there is more variability in the inner cell mass, and so it is not a question of concordance. And sometimes we've never done such tests. There are studies on that, but in principle, it's about what part of the blastocyst is more representative of the real genetic potential of that embryo, and that part is the trophoectoderm. And for example, even now when we are talking about non-invasive pgt-m, we are making the comparison between the culture, the free DNA in the culture media, with the trophoectoderm biopsy. Okay, so because we know that's the part that better represents the embryo. So I would say, and now this would be kind of a bold statement, that if the concordance between both of these parts of blastocyst is very high, this means that there is also mosaicism in the trophoectoderm, which is not good. Okay, so the reason in the past we were all doing biopsies of the inner cell mass, but these days we are focusing on the trophoectoderm for a reason. I'm not the author of those studies and not a specialist on that, but this is because after being a lot of studies have been done, we have found out that the trophoectoderm actually is more representative and more related with the information that we need.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. It's definitely an interesting question. Something else. So this is good to hear as well. And well, as I mentioned, that was it looks like that was our final question. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, for your amazing questions, for sharing your stories, because that means that I do believe it's been helpful for you. Actually, I know it because there are some comments here that you can see, Dr. Silva, a really informative session. Well, definitely cannot agree
Good luck.
with this. So thanks so much. And
Thank
if
you.
there's anything else you would like to add before we finish.
Thank you. Well, There is one patient here. Baba
Okay.
is making a comment.
Yep.
I know her. I'm just saying hi, and so, well, wonderful. Good luck for your pregnancy, Babette. Fingers crossed for you. And so, thank you for having me. Okay, Caroline. It's like I said, always a pleasure, and please feel free to ask whatever. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you all. And it's always a pleasure to be here. And like Maria says here, good luck, everyone. That's the most important thing to say.
Definitely. Thank you so much indeed. You know, it's always great to have a webinar with you. So I'm glad that you are back with us. And of course, I'm already looking forward for some more webinars. And to all of you, what can I say? Good luck, definitely. And as you know, we will be back next week. There is another webinar. We will be here every single Tuesday from now on. So I hope that you will be able to join us. And I'm glad to hear that. It's good to see that it's helpful for all of you. And we know, you know, this is, of course, a webinar. You can ask questions, but if you wish to get some more details, I always encourage everyone to get in touch with Dr. Silva, his team at Ferticentro, and I'm sure they will be happy to help you out. And thank you for sending the email address in here as well, of course.
If they need it.
Thank you so much. Remember, it has been, of course, recorded. So if anyone would like to have a look at it or share it with anyone, you can do it. It will be available tomorrow on our website, myivfenses.com, and of course on our YouTube channel. And well, I hope to see you here next week. But of course, Dr. Silva, we are in touch. And of course, I'm looking forward to the next one already. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Have a good evening,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.